Welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button for more great read-alouds. Enjoy the story. Pass, Go, and Collect $200. The real story of how Monopoly was invented. Written by Tanya Lee Stone, illustrated by Steven Salerno. What kind of Monopoly player are you? Do you save your money until you land on Park Place or Boardwalk? Do you buy up all the properties you can? Do you always want to be the banker? Do you and your friends like to make the game last for days, or find ways to play a shorter game? Monopoly is one of the most famous games in the world. More than 1 billion people have played it in 111 countries. 1 billion! Monopoly is really about making and losing money. The person with the most money and property at the end of the game wins. Have you ever wondered who invented Monopoly, or how rich and famous that person became? Was the inventor of Monopoly the ultimate winner? We need to look back more than 100 years to find out. Elizabeth Maggie, or Lizzie, as she was called, was the woman of many talents. She was smart, made people laugh easily, wrote poetry and short stories, and enjoyed acting. Sometimes Lizzie would dress in a costume, knock on her own door, and trick her husband into thinking she was someone else. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind publicly either, which was brave behavior for a woman at the time. Perhaps the most important thing about Lizzie Maggie, though, was that she took issues of fairness quite seriously. In the late 1800s, millions of Americans left small towns and farming areas to move to cities, where workers were needed more than ever before. Of course, they had to have places to live. A small number of wealthy people began to buy as much land as they could and build houses and apartment buildings. They charged people fees or rent to live there. The more land the owners controlled, the higher the rent increased. This created a situation in which the landlords would become wealthier while renters or tenants stayed poor. Lizzie thought this was a terrible arrangement, but it gave her a great idea. She created a game to show people how unjust the landlord-tenant relationship could be. The winner was the player with the most land and money at the end of the game. The other players usually went broke in the process. Lizzie also came up with a second set of rules to show a fairer way to play, which had players sharing money when it was earned. She likely knew that the first, more competitive way to play would be more popular. Her complicated game was designed for grown-ups, but she believed kids were smart enough to play too. Lizzie hoped kids would see just how unfair the first set of rules was and grow up to play by the second set in real life. Lizzie Maggie called it the Landlord's Game, and in 1903 she filed a patent to claim credit for her invention. Lizzie's patent detailed her game rules, included a drawing of the board and its pieces. It was the first time anyone had ever filed a patent for a board game. The patent was granted in January 1904, at the time when women received fewer than 1% of all U.S. patents. To play her game, Lizzie used dice, a bank with play money, and two kinds of cards, luxury and legacy, that a player might draw during a turn. She had 4 railroads, each one placed in the middle of each side of the board. There were 22 properties, or lots, each with a purchase price and a rent value. Any player landing on a lot owned by another player had to pay rent. 3 of the corners on Lizzie's boards were labeled Public Park, Go to Jail, and Jail. Players who went to jail had to pay a fine or stay there until they rolled doubles. The 4th corner of Lizzie's board was called Mother Earth. Each time players passed Mother Earth, completing one turn around the board, they collected $100. Does any of this sound familiar? Lizzie Maggie kept improving her game, designing a new board in 1906. She and 2 friends manufactured a small number of them. Lizzie added some new rules, including charging more rent for owning multiple railroads. Fans of the games also started using handmade boards. Pretty soon, lots of people were playing her game. One of them was a man named Scott Nearing. He taught business at the University of Pennsylvania and took Lizzie's game to class to teach his students about landlords and rent. He and his students loved the game. They started calling it Monopoly because that's the term used when an owner gains sole control over a group of properties. The students made replicas of the game. They shared them with other students at other colleges. The Landlord's Game was probably the most complex game of its time, but people enjoyed its many ideas and rules. Word spread, and soon more and more people were playing Lizzie Maggie's game, although most didn't know it was her idea. Do you ever change the rules when you play Monopoly with your friends? Well, that's what was happening with Lizzie's game. It became common for people to make their own boards, often adding local street names, and tweak the rules to their liking. In 1909, Lizzie Maggie showed her game board to George Parker. George and his 2 brothers owned the Parker Brothers Game Company. They admired her game, but they thought it was too challenging and educational. They turned her down. She made more changes and tried to sell her game to Parker Brothers again, but they still weren't interested. In 1924, Lizzie renewed her patent. This time, she added a rule that allowed a player who owned all railroads or utilities to double the rent. And her improvements rule allowed players to add houses to their property, increasing the rent. None of this stopped Lizzie's game from continuing to attract new players. Devoted fans kept making their own changes. The most lasting changes happened in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1930. Ruth Hoskins, a young Quaker teacher, and her friends renamed most of the properties after Atlantic City streets and neighborhoods. They were inspired by locations such as St. Charles Place, Ventnor Avenue, and Boardwalk. Someone else came up with the color sequences and dividing the properties into groups of 3. Atlantic City players added hotels to the game as well. Around this time, a huge financial crisis called the Great Depression struck. All across the country, companies and farms went out of business. People had trouble paying for everything from food to rent. By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans had lost their jobs. One of them was a man named Charles Darrow. He and his wife had dinner with friends who happened to have an Atlantic City game board. They taught the Darrows how to play. Charles loved the game and decided to make his own board. He asked his friends for copies of their rules. You know how some people have a knack for taking something great and making it even better? Well, that's what Charles Darrow did. The first board he made was round, although he quickly went back to the idea of the square board. The round one had inspired Charles to draw larger rectangles with bars of colors on the top, one for each group of properties. He also created new designs with the help of stencils for the chance question marks, the waterworks faucet, the electric company light bulb, and the railroad trains. Here was another big change. Instead of sharing the game freely like most others had done, Charles started selling sets to friends. Nearly broke, he thought it might be a good way to earn money for his family. He made each one by hand, drawing the game board on a large piece of oilcloth with pen and ink and using oil paint for the colored bands. He cut scraps of wood into houses and hotels and painted those too. He also typed up the rules. Each game took about 8 hours to make. Soon, Charles Darrow advertised his version, claiming credit as its inventor. With some of the profits he earned from selling his sets, Charles paid to have 500 game boards made by a small local printing firm. He asked a cartoonist friend, Franklin Alexander, to help him improve the look of the game. Franklin added illustrations such as the go-to-jail police officer and Jake the jailbird, the man behind the bars. Charles Darrow's colorful board made Monopoly look more dynamic than ever. The 1934 board looks much like the one we know today. On the box, it said simply, Monopoly. Charles tried to sell the game to 2 companies, one of which was Parker Brothers. He was turned down, just like Lizzie. But Charles did not give up. He persuaded the big department store and the famous toy store to stock his Monopoly sets for Christmas. Pretty soon, other stores signed on. Parker Brothers heard that Charles Darrow's Monopoly game was quickly becoming a big hit. It was selling so well that the no Parker Brothers had given him before was about to turn into a yes. Charles signed a contract with Parker Brothers that included naming him as the game's inventor. Uh-oh. Trouble? You know that Charles didn't invent Monopoly. Lizzie Maggie did. You also know that the others made changes to her game, and it was passed from community to community across the country. But Charles Darrow's round of changes, his success in selling it, and the new attitude at Parker Brothers finally made the company give Monopoly a chance. To protect anyone from copying it, Parker Brothers needed a patent. Can you guess what happened next? Parker Brothers discovered Lizzie Maggie's patent. George Parker then remembered Lizzie trying to sell him her game years before. After having made an earlier claim that Monopoly was his brainchild, Charles Darrow admitted he had worked from an existing game, but he didn't know who created it. Parker Brothers had a big problem. The company needed to own Lizzie's patent to be able to sell Monopoly. In November 1935, George Parker traveled by train to Lizzie's home to talk with her. He offered her $500, the equivalent of almost $9,000 today, and promised to publish her original Landlord's game, as well as 2 other games she had also invented. Lizzie Maggie agreed, and on the last day of December, more than 30 years after she first invented her board game, Parker Brothers owned all the rights to Monopoly. Charles Darrow was about to become a millionaire. Wait, what about Lizzie? Charles was going to make millions, and she was only getting $500? The whole reason she invented the Landlord's game was to show how unfair money issues can become when someone takes sole control over a property. At first, Lizzie Maggie was content with the deal she struck because her ideas would finally reach a mass audience, but she didn't stay content. When Lizzie saw Monopoly for sale in 1936 with Charles Darrow named as its inventor, she was shocked and furious. And she wasn't the only one. Many of the players who added to the game before Charles came along were also upset. Lizzie Maggie didn't hesitate to talk to reporters at the Washington Post. Although the paper ran the story about Lizzie being the original inventor, the news of her claim eventually faded. Today we know that without Lizzie Maggie, there likely would never have been a game called Monopoly for us to play and love. Her initial idea is the heart of the game, and without Charles Darrow, Monopoly might not have become America's favorite board game. All the other folks who added their stories along the way helped make it great too. So who wins in this story? What do you think? Did Lizzie Maggie make a wrong move? Did Charles Darrow? How would you have played it? In any case, there is no doubt that millions of people all over the world adore Monopoly.